Yeah, my own background is 20 years in state comprehensive schools. Most of them were within a radical tradition of education, which is one of the things I want to come back to, actually, and emphasise that not all schools are the same, just as not all youth work is the same. So 20 years working with young people in those contexts, and then you can see by my lack of hair and the colour of my hair that I'm not just 40 years old. So the other 20 has been working with schools and with other organisations concerned with education, which is of course one of the issues that's been quite rightly raised, that education and schooling are not the same. And too often schooling is not about education, but sometimes it is. So there's a little bit of a defence here. I feel a bit under siege in this context. But a couple of other words before I start. And one is that I'm really honoured to be here at MMU and at this gathering for two reasons. Firstly, MMU has a national reputation for radical scholarship that engages with contemporary and continuing issues of importance. So you're lucky to be part of that institution. And colleagues like Janet, John Shostak, Kerry Facer, Asen Ronan, I'm really pleased to know them and learn from them. The second bit of my introduction is to honour you as youth workers and to say that there's often a tension between the kind of work you do and the work that goes on in schools. But that, as I said earlier, the kind of education and schooling which I'm concerned with, I think sits comfortably within the radical tradition of youth work that many of you here espouse. So I'm nervous, but hoping that those remarks kind of share my nervousness and establish some commonality of values between us. Yeah, so I'm arguing for a radical, democratic, common school. A radical, democratic, common school. A school that is a public space for all citizens, a collective workshop for many purposes and possibilities. So that's what I'm aspiring to. Whether I manage to demonstrate is another matter. But, so there's a few introductory remarks. What I'm going to do is sort of three bits to this. One is to say a little bit about kind of how do we make sense of what's going on at the moment. That's the first bit, reflecting where we are now. Then advocating that we have a radical break with what's going on. Though I'm not sure. The second bit is about a radical break. And the third bit is what might we do in response to this. So that's in a sense what I've planned in this quarter of an hour. And I'm nervous about using PowerPoint as well, because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So some people think, I wish you hadn't used a PowerPoint. But anyway, I'm using one, and I'll try not to muck up what I have to say by this lot getting in the way. So it's intended to be helpful. Okay. The first slide, and I realise that not everybody will be able to see every bit of it, but what I'm trying to articulate here is the fact that at least since 1990, there's been a new phase of involving of teachers and others who work in schools being more open to listening to the voices of young people. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why they've done this, most of which are suspect, but not all of them are. And so I just wanted to start by saying, look, for those of you who see the PowerPoint, on the left-hand side there's a list of things in green, which I think are some of the good stuff that's going on. So there's lots of peer support, young people supporting each other in terms of their own learning between ages as well as within similar kind of ages. A lot of schools now don't just involve students in school councils and that kind of thing, misleadingly called school councils, because they're not school councils, they're actually student councils. But all sorts of ways in which young people are involved in research, the kind of research that John was alluding to earlier, in schools, young people involved in the appointment of members of staff, that kind of stuff. And all of this, of course, can be abused, but I'm trying to pick out some of the more interesting things. So the whole issue of teaching and learning, the notion of a learning walk, where young people and teachers identify an issue that they want to explore, and in a sense explore the reality of that in their own schools and other schools. the whole business of young people being involved in the evaluation of what's going on at the classroom level. Student-led reviews is something I've been involved in recently. The whole notion that instead of parents' evenings, where the voice of a young person is, well, sometimes they're not even present, but where they are, it's usually muted and so on. So the whole notion that young people can plan and lead that as being something that's important and so on. So there is some good stuff going on. I won't go through them all, partly because there isn't sufficient time. But against lots of positive things, there's also some things to worry about. So teachers feeling threatened by some of this, and are saying, well, look, I would do it, but when am I supposed to get the time to do this stuff? Because of all the targets that they have to meet and so on and so forth. There's a whole set of issues. I've been working with young people for quite a long time, and they say, look, Michael, we're fed up with this. We have to go and do questionnaires. We're doing stuff that, in a sense, the quality assurance people who use those terms, are doing. So in a sense, doing the donkey work for, in a sense, evaluation, part of this, that the school should be involved in. And what comes out of this? Is anything innovative coming out of this? All this stuff about voice, or is it merely reaffirming what Ofsted said you should be doing? Is this just this would be very familiar to all of you here. Is it just a box-ticking exercise? And most importantly, whose voices are being heard here? And what do we make of the silences and the overwhelming condescension of most of what's going on? And so if you look at these processes through the lenses of race, class, gender, and ability in inverted commas, because it should be a very contested notion, then we begin to get a very different picture. And actually, why are right-wing governments interested in all this stuff? Do you know what I mean? Whose purposes are being served by all this? So there's some interesting questions to ask about a very mixed. Oops, I know isn't this means to press too many buttons. This mixed picture. Now, in this next slide, what I've tried to do is to develop the term at the top is patterns of partnership. What I've tried to do is to articulate, and I'm not going to, just to reassure you, I'm going to go through it all, just as a point I want to make. Many of you will be familiar with Roger Hart's work on ladders of participation, or Harry Shearer's equivalent work as well. But this is my own version of it that I've developed over a number of years. And you can see at the bottom, for those of you who can see the thing, it's the notion of fairly low level, in fact it isn't participation, but increasingly it's a form of, it's a way in which adults and young people work together, increasingly as equals. And at the top, I've put the notion of, which I want to stick with strongly, the notion of intergenerational learning, which I hope resonates with you. Intergenerational learning as lived democracy. And if any of you want to kind of have a look at this later, then Janet's got the PowerPoint if you want to follow this up later. The point I want to make is that you can look at these kind of really interesting sets of activities, which you'll be very familiar with in terms of the context of your own work, from two very different standpoints. On the left, I put the instrumental dimension, and on the right, what I call the fellowship dimension. So the instrumental dimension is driven by what I call high-performance schooling in the context of market accountability. And I'm hoping you can kind of make the transfer to the context of youth work and working with young people. That context is the same for me as it is for you. You might name it in slightly different ways, but actually what's going on there, this involvement bit, is actually part of a process of making discerning consumers. It's a market-based thing. Or, in the contrast to that, on the yes, it is the right-hand side, is the notion of a person-centered approach to education, which is actually about creating democratic fellowship between persons. Now, how you interpret what's going on will be very different according to the standpoint from which you're coming. So to give you an example, you can have, the whole notion of encouraging relationships. Now that could be about doing relationships, about relationships management, the typical kind of managerial nonsense that we're all required to parrot all the time. Or it could be a genuine interest and care for young people as persons. Okay? So how the activity is read and understood, what it is you think you're doing, will depend upon the value standpoint from which you come. So the whole notion of a collaborative project between groups that you might encourage in your work or in my context within schools. That, even though it's a collaborative project, the rationale for that would be, well, oh yes, it's good for me to do this because I'm developing my skills for the future. So it's a very atomistic, individualistic understanding of what collaborative work's about. or it could be about a genuine pursuit of common goals. So at the point I'm wanting to make here, I think, is that you can look at the same kinds of activity from very different standpoints and come up with very different understandings of what's going on. And what I'm arguing for, as you might imagine, is, in a sense, what was on the fellowship side. So I'm arguing for what I call a person-centred education, what is concerned for young people as persons, not just as bearers of results. It's emergent, it's dialogic, all the things, in a sense, which colleagues in this room know and understand about, as well, if not better than I do. It's about mutual trust and care and respect and so on and so forth. And importantly, about the informal contact on a day-to-day basis. So that's really what I'm arguing for, and what significant numbers of schools do try to do, despite everything else. So that's the notion of the person-centeredness of it. And then the democratic fellowship bit, I'm trying to revive, I think here, the notion of fellowship within radical and social democratic traditions. It's about combining social justice and care for each other within a democratic framework of values. That's what I'm arguing for, and you can see the sorts of things I try to illustrate that. So it is overtly about intergenerational learning, that the power relations, you can't pretend they don't exist, but they must be transparent. Your values need to be articulated and clear to everybody involved, and the whole thing, which goes against, in a sense, the managerialism that has been described so eloquently earlier, which is intolerant of ambiguity and unpredictability. I'm arguing for tolerating those very things. And I'm particularly concerned for the notion of shared responsibility, which actually has a very interesting history, particularly going back to the middle of the last century. And I'm wanting to argue for, and if I had more time, talk about and illustrate the notion of, in this case, a school meeting, or the notion of a meeting which is truly democratic. And there are very few occasions within the context of public education within our country where this has happened, but there are some, and that, in a sense, is what I'm trying to, one of the things I want to emphasise, that there have been some outstanding, but very few, examples of schools who have managed to go against the grain, even within the public education system, and actually demonstrate democracy in action. And there will be similar examples from the history of youth work, which I'm not familiar with, but you will know about. And that's, in a sense, leading me on to one of the next points I want to make, which is the importance of actually making a break from the current dominance of neoliberalism and international capitalism, which is what's, in my view, creating such chaos at the moment. And I use the work of John Berger, one of the great intellectuals of the last century, still alive, I think, John Berger, but great stuff. The culture in which we live, he says, is perhaps the most claustrophobic that has ever existed. In the culture of globalization, there is no glimpse of an elsewhere or an otherwise. The first step towards building an alternative world has to be a refusal of the world picture implanted in our minds. Another space is vitally necessary, and that's exactly what this conference is about. It's imagining and articulating and enacting another space. I'm very fond of the work of a US writer called Russell Jacoby, whose book, actually, you won't be able to see it on there, but it's called Social Amnesia. It came out in the 70s. It's actually a book on psychology. But one of the things that he says here, which I like a lot, is society remembers less and less, faster and faster. The sign of the times is thought that has succumbed to fashion. It scorns the past as antiquated, while touting the present as the best. Society has lost its memory, and with it, its mind. The inability or refusal to think back takes its toll in the inability to think. So part of what I'm arguing for is reclaiming our radical histories within youth work and within education. That's been airbrushed out. It's as if it never existed. But brave people gave their lives for this work, and we've forgotten about it. And that is absolutely scandalous. And we need, in a sense, to honour that work and to use it in order to give us courage and hope to assert that another way of doing things is possible. And not just intellectually possible, though it is intellectually possible, it is practically possible. People have done it. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The next slide is just to sort of, well, the names may or may not resonate with you. And just to say that Alison is looking at Russell Hall's work at the moment. But there are, I mean, you know, we all make a different list. In a sense, well, it matters. It does matter who's on the list. But the importance is that we should all be able to make a list of our own, of people whose work we admire and who have practiced against the grain. And this just happens to be my list. And, you know, on another occasion we could explore it in a bit more detail. But the important thing is that there has to be a list. So part of what I'm saying is that there are resources on which we can draw now. Intellectual resources and practical resources. And the resources of the traditions of youth work in this country and, as this slide suggests, within mainland Europe and indeed internationally. We need to draw on all these things in order to get a sense of the fact that there are other traditions which are sympathetic to the very kind of values that underpin this conference today. So I mentioned social pedagogy very briefly, which is beginning to sort of become better known in England at the moment. But it's basically a tradition originating in Germany, but it's in Northern Europe really, which takes seriously, in a sense, a certain kind of understanding of the relationship between individual persons and society. And it's more than schooling. So it's taking education in its broadest, richest sense, and understanding that often that happens outside of school, and that in a sense a society needs to think through how it attends to that. And radical youth work would be part of that process. So I'm just putting that up to, you know, either to remind you or to alert you to the fact that there is an important resource there in terms of a social pedagogy, and you can see on the screen there some of the key values that underpin that work. And those are values that resonate with me as someone who's worked within the context of formal education. And to remember that it's the international traditions. So the work of Anton Makarenko in the Soviet Union in the 20s kind of went a bit off the rails of Stalinism in the 30s, but in the 20s there was some wonderful work that Makarenko did. The Road to Light, 3 volumes, I'm sure you can get it in less than 3 volumes. You know, so in the Soviet Union, huge civil war, huge numbers of people killed, lots of young people roaming the countryside, creating absolute mayhem. You know, the parents were dead. Terrorizing cities and villages, and what were you to do? So the interesting work that Makarenko did, at least in the 20s, if not the 30s, So I've just picked that up as one example, and the work of Lawrence Kohlberg in the United States very different in the 70s. But the notion that, in a sense, he was arguing that schools need to be participatory democracies. Participatory democracies. And his argument was, this was funded by Harvard University for 10 years, and we've all forgotten about it. But he was arguing, look, you're not going to involve young people in political processes, and actually the school is itself a living democracy. And his work was trying to articulate that on a day-to-day basis. But everybody's forgotten, well, not everybody, maybe people in this room. But, we've largely forgotten about that. And so there are kind of resources which we can use in order to make that radical break, which in a sense I'm suggesting might be exciting and important to do. Okay, on to the last 5 minutes now, which is what should we do now? Or what might we do now? We should do now. I want to pick up on the notion of prefigurative practice, which is something that Janice and I have talked a little bit about together, but this is really kind of is a notion that had particular resonance in the 70s. And really it's arguing that we can't wait. If we want a revolution, and we may or may not want one, but we can't wait. We need to do something now. And it's really suggesting that we need to develop new ways of working that, in a sense, anticipate a more emancipatory future. But we need to do it now. But we can't do everything that we want to now. So what sorts of things might we do now that will help us create stepping stones to a better future. So this is what the notion of prefigurative, imagining and enacting the future now. This is what this is arguing for. And this is a quote from a really good guy, Roger Dale, saying, rather than waiting until all the necessary social engineering has been done, education, in its broadest sense, not just schooling, through its processes, the experiences it offers, the expectations it makes, should prefigure in microcosm the more equal, just and fulfilling society. Schools, and in your context it would be schools, but it would be another organisational context, should not merely reflect the world which they are part of, but be critical of it, and show in their own processes that its shortcomings are not inevitable, but can be changed. So it's that kind of argument we're talking about here. And I'm to read these out because I'm overrun a little bit on time in terms of earlier parts of what I wanted to say. But in the book Peter Moss and I have written, and Peter Moss is an early years educator, an absolute joy working with him because he had a much richer knowledge of that aspect of education and also of mainland European traditions than I did. So I learned a huge amount. But we both picked up on the work of a US Marxist called Eric Olin Wright, and a Brazilian, actually he's a lawyer, he's got a professor of law at Harvard, Roberto Unga, who's looking at you from the bottom bit of the screen. And they're both arguing for similar things. They're both saying, look, we need, in terms of Wright, a way station is in a sense an institutional alternative that offers a stepping stone to the future. Okay? And Unger's arguing for a similar sort of thing, except he uses a different language. We need to establish, he says, small-scale, fragmentary versions of future society. Because without these kinds of experimental anticipations, there would be no way to pass from one set of assumptions about group interests, collective identities, and social responsibilities to another. So they're both arguing, and actually they draw on the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci a little bit, saying, look, we can't just wait for something to happen. We have to do something now. And how we work now, the kind of institutions and ways of working that we want to develop now, should in a sense demonstrate our values and our faith in a very different way of being. And it's working towards a revolutionary situation, but it isn't. It's incremental. And a lot of people would attack it because of that. But I think there's something in there. So that's what they're arguing for. And the last few minutes, what I want to do is to say just a little bit about my sort of going on from my reading of Unger and Wright and the feminist tradition, which Janet knows a lot more about than I do, of course, which take the notion of prefigurative practice seriously. So what I'm trying to do, and we'll do, and then to be a bit quick, but nonetheless give you a flavour for what I'm trying to argue for. The notion that, well, you might say to me, well, yeah, it sounds quite nice, this notion of prefigurative practice, Michael, but what do we do? Can you analyse it a bit? So this is an attempt, very imperfect, to analyse, in a sense, rather than just getting hot under the collar about it and saying, we need to do this. What might we do? So what are the components, if you like, of a version of prefigurative practice? And this is my quick go at this. And so it's the notion of, and I won't worry about the bullet points too much. It's the notion that it must be about profound change. It's not about, in a sense, superficial tinkering. So that there must be a commitment to profound change, and we all had a discussion about what that meant, but it must be there. There must be this basis. And education, in its broadest sense, would form an important part of this. In the kind of work that you do and the kind of work that I do, and so on. And it must be explicitly committed to certain kinds of democratic processes. For me, also, what I've called a positional restlessness. This is from, in a sense, the egalitarian position. So there's an unease with hierarchy, a resistance to labelling people, an openness to possibility that honours difference and denies deference. The notion of provisionality being really important. So what I call a permanent provisionality. So this is, in a sense, a constant apprehension about authority. The importance of opening up spaces for exploration. I feel a bit embarrassed about this next phrase because it's a bit of a mouthful and it sounds just appalling. But anyway, that's what I came up with. It's the notion of the holistic bit, i.e. the interconnectedness of it, of your work. So your being needs to demonstrate what it is that you're about. We had a quote from Gandhi earlier. So you must be the change you want to see in the world. That's arguing that, in a sense, get out of your compartments, and everything about the organisation and your way of working should interrelate, and it needs. So that holism should transgress the boundaries that constantly get in the way. And the notion of community, I know, has come under a lot of attack. I want to argue for the notion of agonistic, or the notion of community with, at the heart of which is contestation and argument. You'll know from what I've said already that I think the notion of actually contesting history, there is no one history. There's histories plural. And my account of the histories of what I admire and which I wish to aspire to will be different from yours, and yours will be different from someone else's. We need to choose, as Unger says, choose our genealogies. So the notion of kings and queens history of England, well, okay, that's someone's history, but is not mine. So part of a prefigurative practice should be able to point to histories that resonate with you and demonstrate your own values. But it shouldn't be one that tramples upon the experience of ordinary men and women. So that's what I mean by the persistent pull of personalism. So it's that wariness of betraying and belittling ordinary people, and ordinary is not meant as a condescending term here. So we need to be wary. And the notion of radical instrumentalism, I've already said a little bit about. The possibility that you can, in a sense, by constantly adding things, there will be a break. You'll be able to make a break. Now, I know a lot of people won't agree with that. I'm sticking to it and hoping that that might be something. And just to finish off now, one of the great kind of weaknesses of much of the work that went on in the 70s, particularly from the libertarian tradition, was that it wasn't sufficiently strategic enough. It did not make alliances, connect with social movements and so on in the way that, and this was, in a sense, the left critique of libertarianism would always say that, and I think that's right. So that, and we know that much better now, and you know that better now. So the whole notion of local, regional, national, international solidarities. Solidarities absolutely will sink without it, you know. And the notion of institutional transformation, I think what I'm trying to say here and what Unger says is, if you work in an institution or a context that's doing this stuff, that, in a sense, I've called it the power of presence. People can't argue about it because, in a sense, you're doing it. It's not just theoretical, and that carries a lot of weight when you're trying to convince people about things. It's going to be imperfect, but it actually exists, you know? And lastly, the notion of language in all this. So we can all get hot on the collar about this and so on, but unless we use language that engages with people and excites people, it's going to be, in a sense, an arid list of how many points have I made? 12, etc. So there we go. And just to say that what I've then tried to do, but I'm not, you'll be pleased to know, going on to do now, is to say, well, how can we use the notion of prefigurative practice to narrate an account of a radical, democratic, common school? And I hope that those aspirations that I have resonate to some degree with the values which you all espouse as part of youth work. Thank you.